You're listening to GRC Explained Right, the show that cuts through the compliance chaos. We don't just talk frameworks, we show you how to take governance, risk, and compliance and turn it into true enterprise resilience and strategic value. Get ready to move beyond the checklist and master the critical concepts with experts from the ISACA Orange County chapter.
Welcome to the GRC Explained Right podcast. The title says it all, because governance, risk, and compliance can be confusing, complex, or critical. We try to explain it right. This is a podcast from the members of the ISACA Orange County chapter, created specifically for the GRC professionals, early or mid-career for the auditors and cybersecurity professionals. We move beyond the theoretical concepts because there's a lot of content out there and deliver pragmatic, field-tested guidance. Learn from our guests how to translate GRC into business value. My name is Victor Monga. I am your host of the podcast today. I am joined by my co-host, Pradeep Simha, Chapter President, ISACA Orange County Chapter, and our guest of the day is Jeffrey Aguilar. Jeffrey is currently the Chief Information Security Officer. I was going to say CISO, but I'm going to abbreviate for you, for Hoag Health System in Newport Beach. Before stepping into healthcare, he was the CISO for LA County Office of the CIO. He holds an MBA from Pepperdine University, very impressive, Jeffrey, and continues to serve as an adjunct professor and advisory board member at the Pepperdine. I got to learn from you how you manage all of this. He's a man who explains GRC right, as evident by his extensive certifications. He holds ISACA CISM, C-Risk, and the CDPSC GRC program. Let's talk about that, Jeffrey. So my first question is, and this was from a short survey we did for about 72 people. If I don't have a GRC experience and I am inheriting that as part of my new responsibility, where do I start?
Where do you start is such an interesting question. Being fully transparent, I've worked for organizations that didn't have GRC as a program. I spent multiple years trying to get what's the value proposition, right? How do we position this thing correctly? Because at the end of the day, outside of the knowledge, skill, and ability, the people, the reality is we need funding, right? GRC is not a simple thing to stand up. You really have to take a step back to understand just the size of the organization. Small organizations, if you don't have legislative requirements to use as leverage, you're really creating an argument based on risk versus resilience, right? And the best way to capture risk and to catalog it is through GRC. When I use GRC, I'm not talking about the application. I'm talking about GRC as a program, right? The application is the tool which augments the program,
right,
but it's really establishing that baseline understanding of the what and the why. The challenge with that, from my experience, is how do you make that a non-technical conversation? Depending on a CISO, who you report to, there's different types of CISOs in the industry. In my opinion, you got to take a look inward at what type of CISO are you? Are you more of a technical resource? Because that's very different than the messaging from a technical person,
right,
versus a true business strategist.
And there's a big debate about that, Jeffrey, right? So CISOs who come from the technical background or who have the deep technical background, and now they are CISOs versus the business or finance track CISOs, or like the CEOs turned into CISOs. Like those are different messaging because they actually have the different way of thinking about the business and risk.
100%. And I think just having that self-awareness as a CISO, what type of CISO are you, right? Even interviewing, right? To be very transparent, I always ask organizations, what type of CISO are you looking for? If they're looking for the jack of all trades, then for me, I know where my expertise is. I would probably withdraw from that process. I'm more of a strategist and more of an advocate, right? How do we really work as a trusted advisor to the senior leadership? So there's so many things that come with it, but in the context to your original question from a GRC program perspective, at the beginning of the day, you really have to understand the organization, the business, what's the bottom line mission, right? Because if you could understand the mission and what the business objectives are, you can create narrative and figure out what are the levers that I can pull on to really sell this program along with the value proposition. It's a complicated conversation.
Yeah, Jeffrey. So I think one of the other question when you mentioned about as an advisor, right? So what we see is like many C-suite executives still view GRC as a cost center. So which is like a necessary evil focused on ticking regulatory boxes, right? So I'm thinking like if an organization is not currently bound by strict any compliance requirements like HIPAA or GDP, like would it still be a valid consider like a formal GRC program, Jeff? And also like in your experience, right, like what would be that primary strategic value proposition of GRC in that scenario? And like what are some of the pros and cons of building a program without like a strict mandate, like a legal mandate?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to what we were just talking about. Without legislative requirements that you can pull as levers, because there's a compelling argument to be made if you're trying to achieve compliance, but compliance doesn't mean secure, right? In the healthcare space, you can be compliant and not be secure from a cybersecurity perspective.
Right.
Legislative is for the most part not prescriptive. If anyone that's read the CFR, it's pretty poorly written. I dropped it in a Copilot and asked for it to create a summary, and the irony is it hallucinated. It There wasn't enough to give me a good summary, right? But I think the value proposition, without having those legislative levers, it's really, I mean, to me, this is cookie cutter isoke. It's the narrative around risk versus resilience.
Right.
How does risk apply to security transformation? And then how does that transformation directly add value to the bottom line of the business? Now, depending on the type of business, there's thousands, if not millions of different types of businesses. But at the end of the day, what's that underlying objective? What's that mission? Right. And for me personally, a lot of my value props are tied back to the organization, whatever the overarching business objective is, that mission. When I was in government, not-for-profit government organization, it's all about protecting the data. And I think that's a common theme. If you could kind of articulate what are those themes for my organization, you've got the start of a value proposition. It's just creating a narrative at that point to take it forward, right? And I believe the best narratives, this comes back to storytelling. I do a lot of presenting on storytelling to a board. Because if you can create some kind of an emotional connection, then you've captivated your audience. Now, at the end of the day,
let's double click on that one, Jeffrey, because we hear that a lot as well, right? So for early stage career or mid stage career CISOs who are stepping into this, would you give a specific example how to actually tie that, what you just said, narrative to business value, so that we're not talking about why doing this should be on the name of protecting data or protecting the mission, but what exactly, like tying back to the business or mission value? So in the healthcare, let's say it's the patient data, let's say, or the lives itself. But how would you say that? How do you quantify that? If I do GRC, if I would do these things, that will help. Like, what would you have a story that will be enlightening and that will be something that people can resonate?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's talk hypothetical, right? In the context of healthcare, you could build a value proposition based on the intangibles, right? And the intangible, the primary one I can think of is reputation loss. Now, consider all of us use healthcare for the most part. So what if your HMO had a big breach, huge compromise, it's front page of the news, potential national attention, right? As a consumer of the service, how likely are you to continue doing business with them, right? From a patient perspective, because if a health record gets out, you have to consider the worst case scenario. You have PHI, you have PII.
Totally.
You have potentially treatment plans, allergy history, things like that. In the dark web, that could easily be monetized with pharmaceuticals, targeted marketing. I think very effective narratives can be drawn just from intangibles and reputation.
Yeah.
Within CISM, the power of a GRC program is you literally have a catalog of risk, right? The tricky part with GRC is setting the technology up is one thing, workflows is another thing. Register is extremely basic. I personally like Risk IT. I leverage it all the time. The templates are good. But then how do you get the organization to buy in on a risk appetite? Risk appetite means something very different depending on who you talk to, right? So within the world of cyber risk, because you have to keep in mind, risk management is just a pillar under a much larger umbrella of risk management.
Right. That could be business, finance. Risk could be, as you said, could be completely different definition of risk based on who you're talking to. CFO, CEO, COO, CIO, CISO.
Yeah, and I think the power of the CISO is being able to have the conversations across all of these different stakeholders, but then being able to hold the technical conversation with the engineers. At the start of my career, I was an engineer. I was a network engineer, security engineer. I mean, I built infrastructure all over the world, and at one point moved to leadership, but being able to very deliberately balance between the different lenses that you're addressing these issues with. For one, it creates that trusted advisor relationship. And especially if you're trying to sell, let's say a GRC program or security to a board or senior leadership, they have to view you as a trusted advisor. Your word has to mean something. Professional integrity is everything. I can't think of conferences I haven't gone to in the last 5 years that I didn't know a quarter of the people in the room, right? I'm sure you experience this all the time. Any event you go to, you know somebody.
Small world. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so why not use that world and that network and capitalize on lessons learned of the network? There's a lot of power out there within the community. I'm in a Signal chat with, I think we're at 52-ish healthcare CISOs across the nation.
Okay.
Yeah, we constantly collaborate. We're constantly asking questions. Hey, has anyone tried this? I'm pivoting my program this direction. Has anyone done it?
That's awesome.
Yeah, why start over, right? Lessons learned have been established, leverage them.
And that's great. Actually, you're leveraging the power of peers as well. So let me pivot and let me talk about some of the GRC programs I've seen failing when leaders like CISOs or the directors or the managers simply announce a policy that, hey, on the name of GRC, we're going to do this, and then disengage. So from the ISECA definition of governance is about setting the tone at the top. Beyond allocating budget, what are the 2 specific observable actions that you would do quarterly to demonstrate or monthly, whatever that frequency and cadence is, to consistent leadership commitment and ensure GRC is truly practiced and not preached? Like, what would those 2 things would be that you would say that let's consistently demonstrate and track and quantifiable way of actually reporting it?
Yeah, I mean, in the world of GRC, right? Because GRC, it's kind of you have to consider it's the risk register, it's the holy grail. If a GRC is done right, the platform can be configured to consume all assessments, let's say in the last 3 years. You can roll all of that into some kind of a priority, and that priority is going to be driven in combination working with the business, CISO, IT leadership, and chief legal, right? There needs to be a consensus on what are the different triggers to determine a high from a medium to a low. Anything informational, we catalog it, but personally, I don't spend too much time on it.
Sure.
But then from that point, it's building narrative, right? And sometimes that narrative is, can we afford reputation loss, right? What if you're a product vendor or some kind of a manufacturer? You're talking about potential patents, mark secrets, and then what's the potential to market share? Right. And these are all things that have to be considered depending on the line of business. But I think the starting point for anyone is to really understand what's the objective of the business.
Sure.
Have the conversation with the C-level leadership, right? Because the CFO is going to have a different marching order and a different purview and directive versus a CEO or COO. It's great to have these conversations with everyone and figure out what are the resonating themes. And then I would build a narrative around those resonating themes focused on risk versus resilience. Boards understand risk and resilience. They don't care about acronym soup. Within GRC, what I like to do to show a meeting, I have KPIs and KRIs I report on.
Yeah.
But I don't go down the road. I've read every industry report there is. I'm a fan of Gartner. I read all the research, but I take things a little bit of a different approach. I try to look for themes within geopolitical landscapes that relate regionally directly to my organization, right? So when I was working for LA County, because the county was such a broad organization, geopolitical events are very broad and widespread, right? Elections, tax collection, operations, you name it, it's there plus elected officials. In healthcare, okay, well, let's look at the horizon. What's been announced within healthcare outside of the changes to HIPAA, right? There's potential implications because of the big, beautiful bill. It's taking things like that are coming from the feds and our local municipalities and kind of pulling that in and having that conversation with legal or the regulators or OCR in the context of healthcare. And what's this really mean to me?
I must ask you, Jeffrey, how does this feel? This seems like a completely different spectrum versus what you said. You started your journey as a network engineer, and that's where I started as well, as an ethical hacker.
Mm-hmm.
Do you miss it? The old life, if you will?
I miss tinkering because, at the start of my career, my end game was to be an engineer, right? And once you achieve success in a certain functional area, you
pivot.
Yeah, I wanted to stretch myself. And honestly, when I pivoted over to management, it was because I was frustrated with existing leadership because they had never been in the trenches. They'd never been there and done it as an engineer, gone through scope creep, just requirements that for one, or maybe they're valid, but to implement might be impossible. The tech might not be there yet. Right.
So you turn the table, you're like, all right, I got to be in the driving seat here.
Yeah. If you're driving the car, you can literally point the direction of where the program needs to go. And I think that's one of the things I like about the CISO because it's a big game of chess.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a lot to it. It's interesting and it's challenging, but I've never met a CISO in the seat that didn't have experience that personal challenge or the heartache that comes with making the wrong call, because nobody's perfect. We all make the mistake.
Yes, and also I think you were mentioning about like how Gen AI is also changing. Right? One follow-up question I had was so recently I have been seeing like with Gartner's immediate move towards generative AI into the top five CISO priorities. Right? In 2024, I think that's what they said. Hey, like there is a lot of shift between the Gen AI. So now, as a CISO, like what are some of the emphasizing things you are seeing to make sure we have that robust control measures, Jeff? And also, like in your strategic view, right, what is that most urgent governance control that a CISO needs to implement today? Like even to mitigate those immediate risk of AI, right, while we are still enabling those business innovations, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, AI is here to stay, right? I mean, I think everyone in the industry can agree on that. I think the advantage I had is under government, we started working on AI years ago, right? When GTP was first put out there, we were already looking at it. Governance quickly came. I think from a CISO perspective, the worst thing we can do is to stop innovation, right? The worst thing that I could do in my current organization is start telling our digital officer and the folks that are pushing innovation, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it because it's scary. We don't understand it.
They'll find a way. You could say no all day, but they'll find a way.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the workforce is smart, right? There's a lot of savvy folks that are always going to find a way. It doesn't make sense to try to block it, but what can we do to establish those guardrails, right? So from a CISO perspective, I'm thinking about policy. I'm thinking about language to the acceptable use agreement, working with chief legal and trying to establish what are these boundaries, what are the guidelines, right? Because kind of walking through ISACA, what they teach under the different certs, policy are more the statements of intent, procedures are one thing, but if we have a policy statement followed with, let's say, an acceptable use agreement. And then for the people that want to develop, they're working on LLM development. They're looking at use cases for Copilot. How do I apply this at work? Outside of the T's and C's, the contractual language, there are some things that we can do along with best practices and guidelines, right? And a good example of that would be copying organizational information into a public instance of Gemini or Copilot. Just bad practice. So why not put some boundaries around that under an administrative control? From a tools perspective, because I personally have Copilot and Gemini on my phone. If you stop me at work, I could just go to my phone off network and start prompting the same type of questions. So instead of blocking it, why not enable it, but just in a very deliberate and ethical manner?
So I have a follow-up question, right? So I think I kind of like how you mentioned about human-centric security design, right? And what we are seeing is probably even Gartner is anticipating that probably by end of 2027, there might be a 50% of large enterprise CISOs will adopt this human-centric security design, right? So then recognizing that people are central to control adoption. And how do you see that shift in GRC focus from designing controls purely for auditors and also trying to create controls that are practical? Probably like, as you mentioned, someone can just take those prompt questions, go back to home and use those prompt questions on the chat GPT, right? So we want to know like what are those auditors like where they're trying to create those controls that are practical and also user friendly, right? And make sure they have to do an embedded seamless into our existing business workflow, Jeff. So what's your take on this one?
Yeah, I could probably talk an hour just on that one question. When you're designing a control, the worst thing you can do is design a control to meet a compliance requirement. And auditors will audit across frameworks, compliance requirements. There's also different types of audits, right? I think one of the best things you can do is, if you use HIPAA as an example, there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of required versus addressable requirements, but then you have to start to layer on other components regardless of their best practice. What if you're a HIPAA shop, but you take credit cards for pharmacy, right? Now you have PCI implications. So from a control perspective, there's best practices and NIST guidance. ISAGA puts a lot of material out there. NIST is kind of the bread and butter playbook. When you look at the different SP 800 series, there's a lot of valid stuff in there. But when you're creating control design, the first thing you have to do is understand what's the potential business impact. Where I currently work, we do POCs with the doctors, right? Before we might conceive a lot of different ideas in control environments, but the best thing to do is put it in front of a CMIO, a chief medical information officer, who is a doctor, but they also understand tech. They're the voice to the doctors, more of a broker or liaison. How does this potentially affect patient care? Right. The last thing we want to do is introduce a click, because if somebody declares a code, there's some kind of an event, time of emergency. What if that's your loved one on the table? Right. And because of a security control, there's another login. There's something else they have to do. It takes away from their workflow, but then you have to consider life and just, patient and human safety. It's a big balancing act, but for the most part, I mean, controls can be adapted. They're as strict as we make them. If we're looking at controls for like an election system, you're talking very black and white, right? SCADA, you're probably talking air gap systems, things like that. In health space, it's a little bit different, but you still have to take into consideration what's the potential impact. And the only way to truly understand that is to bounce it off the people that are going to be using it.
Totally.
We're not experts at everyone's workflow, but we could propose something, do a POC, pull a dozen people in and figure out what's this actually doing to your day? Is there value?
All right, Jeffrey, I'm going to wrap the podcast with this last question. As we said, the name of this podcast is GRC Explained Right. And you touched upon this a little bit, where CISOs are actually playing the multidimensional chess. And a common reason for some of the GRC failures, if you will, because of the siloed approach, which I said that earlier, you start a policy or you announce a policy and then disengage. As a security leader, you have to engage with security, legal, audit, finance, business, you name it. And what strategic initiatives do you or would you recommend to break down those functional silos, create a unified GRC view that you mentioned? And how did you or would you recommend that you would incentivize different departments to share that risk data transparently? Because that everybody is very concerned about their territory, right? They're like, okay, well, why do I give you my risk data or what I'm concerned about? What would you recommend? How to break those silos to get started?
Yeah, a lot of it's just building the relationships. It's being the trusted advisor. I personally like doing some of these meetings in person, especially if it's somebody new. You have let's say it's the chief legal officer. If you haven't met this person, it makes a lot of sense to get on the calendar, get in front of the person, right? And just how they are as a person. We have to kind of humanize what we're doing because everybody just looks at cyber as, oh, they're about to do something. They're slowing us down, right? They're introducing something else. It's another password. It's it's always something else.
The old guard approach is gone, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I keep hearing about shift left, which, I mean, let's be real. That's been around for decades. It's not new. I don't care what the Forrester and the Gartner report say. Shift left has existed. I've been in the industry 28, 29 years. It's been there since day one. You introduce security early.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's common sense. But in the context of your question, I think governance is king. If a governance program is established and you can get all the stakeholders at the table and everybody agrees on a very deliberate charter, it makes it much easier because then that governance group can be used for risk decisions.
Right.
This is part of GRC, but it extends beyond it, right? Governance, it's more that top-down approach because at the end of the day, everybody is looking for the win for their program. There's a lot of political capital that can be kind of divvied up across key stakeholders just by bringing them through governance, because nobody wants to be left holding the bag that we had the governance structure in place, but we chose not to be a part of it. And because of that, we experienced X, Y, and Z. I hate doing things through scare tactics. It's more about just understanding through narrative, storytelling, making them aware, let's say app dev, if they're creating applications for, let's say, client use, or are they being scanned? Are they following OWASP, or, best practices, coding practices,
Right.
etc. It's explaining risk, and I feel like half of the CISO's job is really consulting. We're getting in front of people, we're building relationships, and we're really teaching through narrative on risk versus the resilience, which is an overarching theme. I'm aware of that, but it holds a lot of value when you start having these conversations.
Yeah, Victor. So, Jeff, thank you very much for a lot of insights. In today's session, we learned a lot of insightful answers from you, right? I think you also mentioned about human-centric versus building those trusted partners, or even building as a trusted security advisor. I think those are like a lot of key takeaways from the session. So definitely thank you very much for today's session, and I really appreciate for building this our ISAC Orange County chapter and giving back to the community as well. So thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks, Victor. Thanks for the session.
Cool.
If there's one key takeaway, especially for the up and coming CISO, it's finding that balance, but it's also not emulating a person's style. I made the mistake of watching people guest speak and trying to copy their pitch. It never worked. It always crashed and burned. And through a lot of failures, you kind of develop your own style. But I can tell you that time and time again, just being that trusted advisor first, title aside, build the relationship, get to know the business, and then you're more effective as a CISO.
Very wise, very wise. Thank you, Jeffrey. What's the best way for our audience to connect with you? Is it LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening to us. And thank you again, Jeffrey, for being on the show and starting our podcast as a first guest speaker. Thanks so much.
It was fun. Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of GRC Explained Right. Don't keep your expertise a secret. Reach out to us today to be a featured expert. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time.